The
I
afternoon
won't
sun
let you
beat
off
down on the
easy.
dusty town of Dry Creek, its relentless heat shimmering over the wooden storefronts and weathered porches. In the center of the town square, a ragged crowd had gathered, eyes sharp with a mixture of anticipation and spite. They clustered like vultures around the scaffold, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats and suspicion. The air was thick with the buzz of gossip, dust, and an unspoken hunger for spectacle. At the center of it all stood Kate Cole, draped in a faded black dress, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly. Her dark hair was pinned back beneath a modest hat, but there was no hiding the haunted determination in her eyes. Today, she was not just a widow. She was the outcast wife of Jesse Cole, the outlaw whose very name could stir a shiver or a sneer in any saloon from Tombstone to Santa Fe. She clutched a crumpled note, the paper worn thin where her fingers had worried its edges all morning. On it, Jesse's hurried scrawl, "Trust no one. The map is for you alone. Survive." It was both a warning and a burden, heavier than any chain. As the sheriff's men lined up with rifles, Jesse, her husband, lover, and curse, stood defiant, head held high, hands bound behind his back. He caught her eye one last time, a crooked grin playing on his lips even as the townsfolk hurled curses and rotten fruit. The children, faces streaked with dust, threw stones that clattered harmlessly at Kate's feet, their mothers making no move to stop them. The guns thundered in unison. Jesse's body jerked and crumpled to the ground. Silence followed, thick and stunned, before a rush of relieved whispers spread through the crowd. Jesse Cole, the outlaw king, was dead, but his shadow still loomed, and that shadow now clung to Kate like a funeral shroud. Townsfolk spat her name, whore, devil's bride, snake's widow. The shopkeepers turned their backs. The preacher, who had once shaken her hand with a smile, now looked through her as if she were made of glass. Even the old stray dogs that roamed Dry Creek kept their distance. Someone pressed closer in the crowd. A narrow-faced man with a jagged scar along his jaw. Kate recognized him. Hank Tolliver, Jesse's old partner. Now a dog sniffing after a fresh scent. His eyes glinted with something far colder than grief. The crowd began to thin, but Kate remained motionless, numb, as if time itself had buckled under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. The dust settled around her shoes, and the wind caught the edge of her veil, snapping it against her cheek. She tasted salt and blood, unsure which belonged to Jesse and which to herself. The square emptied out, but the whispers did not. Kate walked alone through the gauntlet of stairs, her head held high, her heart beating out a strange, hollow rhythm. She kept Jesse's note hidden in her palm, its words burning brighter than the sun overhead. On the walk back to her cabin, the town seemed to shift around her, alleys suddenly darker, faces more hostile. She heard snatches of conversation drifting through open windows. "That's Jesse Cole's widow. Think she knows where he stashed the gold. If I were her, I'd ride out tonight. Ain't safe for his kind round here." The weight of suspicion bore down on her with every step. She cut across the back alleys, passing the general store where she'd once bought coffee and ribbon with Jesse. Now Mrs. Hammond drew the shutters closed before Kate could even glance inside. At the old well, two men in dusters paused their talk, falling silent as she passed. A sudden shout startled her. A pair of boys, maybe 10 or 11, launched a hail of pebbles at her back. One struck her shoulder, the sting waking something fierce inside her. She whirled to face them, but they'd already dashed away, their laughter trailing behind them like a pack of coyotes. Kate pressed onward, the edge of her property coming into view. Her cabin stood at the end of a winding dirt path, half hidden by a tangle of sagebrush and wild rose. Once, she and Jessie had dreamed of painting it, planting a garden. Now it looked more like a ruin than a home. She paused at the threshold. The front door hung slightly ajar, its hinges creaking in the wind. Kate's heart slammed in her chest. She knew, somehow she knew, that she was not alone. Inside, the cabin was a storm of broken glass and overturned chairs. Drawers yanked out, clothes and books strewn across the floor. Someone had rifled through Jessie's things, searching, desperate. Her hands shook as she crossed to the mantel where Jessie's Bible once sat. Gone. But the intruder was gone too. No lingering footfalls. Only the echo of violence in the upended room. Kate's breath caught as she found a scrap of the Bible's binding, left carelessly on the floor. She pressed it to her lips, silent tears stinging her eyes. Was this the beginning of vengeance, or just the next stage of her punishment? Outside, a pair of crows cawed from the fence post, watching her with dark, hungry eyes. Kate forced herself to stand tall. If Jessie's note was right, she could trust no one, not the sheriff, not the town, not even those who claimed to be friends. Somewhere, out there in the wild stretch of the West, men hunted her for a secret she didn't fully understand. But as dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purple and gold, Kate made a promise to herself. She would not run, not yet. The map was out there. Jessie's story, her story, was not finished. Whatever shadows waited beyond the town, whatever men lurked with greed or vengeance in their eyes, she would face them all. For the first time since Jessie's death, Kate felt the stirrings of defiance rising from the ashes of her grief. She was marked by scandal, but she was not broken. Not yet. And as the night fell, cloaking Dry Creek in a hush of secrets, Kate prepared for whatever would come next. Sunrise brought little warmth to Kate as she awoke from a restless night in her ransacked cabin. Shadows lingered on the walls, reminders of the trespass that had shattered what little peace she had left. She set about putting the room back in order, picking up Jessie's scattered belongings with a sense of reverence and dread. The old quilt he favored was torn, and her wedding picture, once displayed proudly on the mantel, now lay face down in the ashes near the cold hearth. The ache of isolation pressed down with every breath. Dry Creek had never been a welcoming place, but now it felt openly hostile. Word traveled fast in towns like this, and suspicion moved even faster. By the time Kate wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, she could feel unseen eyes upon her. Neighbors peering out behind faded curtains, some drawn by pity, more by curiosity or malice. She made her way to the general store, hoping to restock supplies, knowing she would have to face the town eventually. The wooden steps groaned beneath her boots. Inside, the shop was cool and silent, except for the creak of the ceiling fan and the low hum of voices. Old Mr. Harmon, who'd once handed out peppermints to her as a newlywed, now fixed her with a stare as hard as old leather. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his daughter Pearl ducked behind the counter, pretending to busy herself with the ledgers. Kate placed her coins on the counter, but Mr. Harmon shook his head. "We don't serve your kind here anymore." His words fell like a stone, and the other customers paused, watching, silent and judgmental. Kate felt her cheeks burn, humiliation prickling beneath her skin, but she did not plead. With trembling hands, she gathered her coins and turned away, leaving behind the weight of old kindnesses soured by fear. The humiliation followed her as she walked to the church, hoping, foolishly perhaps, for some measure of comfort. The doors stood open, but as she approached, a cluster of townsfolk at the entrance parted to let her pass, only to close ranks behind her, whispering sharp and venomous. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and condemnation. Reverend Ellis met her at the aisle, blocking her path, eyes cold and unmoving. He did not speak, but the message was clear. She was not welcome, not even in the house of God. Driven out, Kate stood for a moment on the steps, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not give them the satisfaction. She turned her back on the church, walking swiftly through the streets. Head high, heart bruised. Memories crowded in, unbidden as she wandered. She thought of Jesse, not the infamous outlaw, but the young man who'd swept her away from a grim future in the city, who'd promised her freedom, laughter, and the wide, wild West. In the dim light of memory, she saw him as he had been, gentle hands brushing her cheek, warm voice whispering dreams into her ear. She remembered long rides through fields of sage, his arms around her waist, his eyes shining with hope and hunger for something better. But Jesse's world was never simple. She'd known from the start that his past would catch up with them, but she'd clung to the belief that love could change a man, or at least shield them from the worst of his enemies. Now, alone in the aftermath, she questioned every choice, every trust. Back at her cabin, as evening crept in, Kate found herself drawn to Jesse's Bible, the only possession spared by the looters, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom. She sat at the table, its surface scarred by years of use and the night's violence, and leafed through the thin, dog-eared pages. Her eyes snagged on a line of writing in the margin, just above the book of Exodus, 2 Timothy 12, verse 4. Her breath caught. It wasn't Jesse's handwriting, but the message was meant for her. Heart pounding, she turned to the passage. Tucked between the pages was a folded scrap of paper, a code Jesse had devised for clandestine messages during his outlaw days. She held it up to the candlelight, deciphering his cryptic symbols, piecing together a riddle that pointed her to the abandoned rail trestle north of town, a place shrouded in secrets and memories best left undisturbed. She barely had time to process the meaning when the hair on her neck prickled. A shadow moved outside the window, just beyond the reach of the dying light. Someone was watching, patient and deliberate. Kate froze, hands tightening on the Bible. She waited, barely breathing, until the shadow melted away into the gathering dusk, but the sense of being hunted lingered long after. Kate spent that night in fitful silence, the coded message clutched in her hand, the memory of the shadow etched into her mind. Dry Creek was no longer merely hostile. It was dangerous. Every corner of her world had turned against her. The warning in Jesse's note, "Trust no one," rang truer than ever. Yet even as fear pressed in, so did a new resolve. If there was a map, if Jesse had left behind secrets worth killing for, she would find them, and she would learn who in this town, once home, now a prison, wanted her gone for good. In the deep hours before dawn, with the desert wind whispering against the glass, Kate began to plan her next move. She was no longer a grieving widow, but a woman marked for vengeance, or for something far worse. Night in Dry Creek brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of dread that seemed to seep through the very walls of Kate's cabin. She barely slept, haunted by the memory of the shadow outside her window and the coded message hidden in Jesse's Bible. Her mind spun with questions she could not answer. What had Jesse left for her to find? Who was watching her in the dark? And how much time did she really have before danger closed in? Dawn crept across the sky in pale streaks of gold and gray. Kate rose, stiff and determined, moving quickly through her small home, packing what she could into a weathered satchel, a handful of dried food, a flask of water, her old revolver oiled and loaded by trembling hands. She tucked Jesse's letter and the coded clue deep into her pocket, pressed close to her heart. Before she could finish, a sudden, acrid scent invaded the cabin, smoke. It seeped beneath the door, thick and choking. In the next moment, a window shattered, and a flaming torch crashed to the floorboards, sending tongues of fire licking across the room. Panic surged, but instinct took over. Kate grabbed her satchel and flung her shawl over her mouth, bolting for the back door as flames raced up the curtains and devoured the kitchen table. She crashed outside into chaos. Masked men circled the yard, their faces hidden by rags, their voices rough with threats. One barked her name, demanding the map. Another brandished a pistol, firing a warning shot that sent a flock of crows screaming from the fence post. Kate ducked low, heart pounding. Her thoughts leaping to Jesse's old horse, a chestnut mare named Dolly tied behind the barn. Smoke billowed, turning dawn into midnight. Kate ran, crouched low, darting past the barn as bullets cracked the air. A bullet split the fence post inches from her head. In a blur of motion, she freed Dolly, flung herself into the saddle and kicked hard. The horse leapt forward, hooves pounding the earth, mane whipping Kate's face as they shot into the open plain. Behind her, the cabin was fully aflame, the roof collapsing with a roar. Kate risked a backward glance and saw the masked men giving chase, their horses churning up the dust. One, riding ahead of the others, pulled down his mask just enough for her to see the jagged scar across his jaw. Hank Tolliver, Jesse's former partner, turned traitor and now the leader of the hunt. Tolliver shouted, rallying his men, their eyes bright with greed and violence. The chase began in earnest. 4 riders against one desperate widow. Kate leaned low over Dolly's neck, urging her onward across the moonlit plain. Sage and scrub blurred past. She heard shouts, gunfire, the pounding of hooves gaining behind her. Each second stretched to an eternity. The landscape opened into rocky hills, where she could disappear if she could only reach them in time. The pursuit was relentless. The ground grew rougher, strewn with boulders and twisted roots. Dolly stumbled once but regained her stride. Kate's lungs burned from the effort, her hands numb from gripping the reins. She glanced back. Tolliver's men were closing the gap, their faces wild with desperation. A narrow ravine split the earth ahead. Kate pressed her heels to Dolly's flanks, praying the mare would trust her one more time. They soared over the chasm, landing hard on the far side. 2 of the riders slowed, unwilling to risk the jump, but Tolliver urged his mount forward, eyes locked on Kate. Desperate, she spurred Dolly into the rocks, winding through a maze of outcroppings where only the surest horse could follow. Bullets struck stone, sending up showers of dust. Kate pressed onward, weaving between shadows and stone, every sense sharpened by the nearness of death. Finally, the shouts faded behind her. She slowed, ears straining for any sound. The moon was high now, painting the rocks with silver and black. Dolly blew hard, lathered and trembling. Kate slipped from the saddle and crouched low, listening. Only the sigh of the wind and the rasp of her own breath broke the silence. She searched Jesse's saddlebag, remembering the compartment he'd shown her once, long ago, a place to hide things from the law, or from men like Tolliver. With trembling fingers, she found the hidden latch and pried it open. Inside was a piece of torn paper, yellowed and delicate, bearing a hand-drawn map fragment and a strange symbol, a circle crossed by two lines. Beneath it, a single word, trestle. Her mind raced, remembering the coded message from the Bible. Everything pointed north, toward the old railway trestle outside town, a place of secrets, and perhaps the only hope she had left. Before she could gather her thoughts, a distant shout echoed through the rocks. Tolliver was still searching, his rage undimmed by her escape. Kate shoved the map piece into her pocket and pulled herself back into the saddle. She guided Dolly deeper into the hills, every nerve on edge. Behind her, the flames of her childhood home flickered against the night, a signal to anyone watching that Kate Cole was no longer welcome in Dry Creek. She was alone, hunted, and running for her life. But now, with Jesse's clues and the truth burning in her veins, she was also dangerous. The first attack had come and gone. The game had changed. Kate would not stop, not until she had answers, or until the West itself swallowed her whole. The sky turned bruised purple as dawn broke over the rocky hills, the last echoes of pursuit fading in the distance. Kate reined in Dolly beneath the twisted shadows of a lone juniper, her breath rising in quick, ragged clouds. The land felt foreign, every shape and shadow bristling with threat. For a long moment, she just sat astride her horse, listening, waiting for another shout, another gunshot, another flicker of movement, but only silence answered. She couldn't linger long. Her mind spun through her options, the edges of her fear sharpening to something more focused. Resolve. With her home gone and nowhere in town to turn, she needed help. Not just any help, but someone clever, desperate, and with as much to lose as she did. Only one name came to mind: Doc Sanders. Once, Dr. Elijah Sanders had been the pride of Dry Creek, a physician with a sharp mind and steady hands. That was before his gambling debts ruined him, before whiskey and bad luck made him the town's disgrace. Still, he'd always treated Kate kindly, patching up Jesse after bar brawls, never asking too many questions. And years ago, in a moment of reckless trust, she had helped him out of a bind that would have landed him in prison. He owed her, and that kind of debt had its uses. The old railway line cut through the badlands west of town, and somewhere along its weed-choked banks, Doc kept a ramshackle shack where he laid low from creditors and the law. Kate guided Dolly along a narrow trail, nerves on edge as the sun rose higher, burning away the night's chill. The world felt larger now, more dangerous, a place where every stranger was a threat and every friend a potential traitor. As she approached the shack, Kate spotted a figure slumped on the porch, hat pulled low over his eyes, bottle in hand. The once fine coat was patched and stained, but the sharp nose and stubborn jaw were unmistakable. Doc Sanders. She hesitated only a moment before dismounting and making her way to the steps, boots crunching on gravel. Doc stirred, groaning as he shielded his eyes from the sun. Recognition flickered in his gaze, quickly replaced by wariness. He stood, swaying, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his belt. Kate told him everything, about the fire, the men hunting her, Jesse's cryptic map, and the threat that now followed her everywhere. She offered no tears, only hard facts and the promise of a debt paid in full. Doc paced the porch, muttering curses, his mind working through the angles. Helping Kate meant crossing Tolliver and the sheriff, who now owed allegiance to the highest bidder. Yet something in her eyes must have moved him, some echo of the old, proud man he used to be. With a grunt he agreed, but only if they moved quickly. They were all in danger now. Inside, Doc's shack was chaos. Books and bandages, empty bottles, a table cluttered with old letters and gambling markers. Kate produced the map fragment and the coded message, spreading them across the table. Doc squinted, tracing the strange symbol with a trembling finger. He remembered Jesse's obsession with puzzles, the way the outlaw could hide secrets in plain sight. They worked together for hours, piecing through clues, arguing over every word and symbol. At last, a pattern emerged. The next step led north, to the abandoned railway trestle where Jesse had once hidden out from the law. Doc knew the place, remembered stories of outlaws and secret caches among the crumbling timbers. As they made ready to leave, a sudden movement outside sent Doc to the window, pistol drawn. A young boy, thin as a willow switch, eyes darting with fear, darted into the clearing, stumbling as he fled from something behind him. Kate recognized him from town, an orphan called Billy. Always running errands for coins or scraps of food, he pleaded for help, panting, eyes wild. Between gulps of air, he blurted out a story of hiding near the sheriff's office, overhearing Tolliver and the deputies plotting. He'd seen them pass a packet, gold coins and a sealed envelope, and had watched as they marked a map, arguing about what to do with the widow. The men had spotted him and chased him into the hills. Despite Doc's protests, Kate insisted they take Billy along. The boy's information was proof she wasn't imagining the threat, and she couldn't abandon him to Tolliver's men. Doc grumbled, but Kate saw the kindness beneath his gruffness, a broken man who still remembered what it meant to help the helpless. As the three of them rode out, a tense partnership formed, each wary of the others, each carrying secrets and scars. Doc's hands shook as he rode, and Billy looked back over his shoulder every few yards, flinching at the sound of distant hooves. Kate kept her eyes on the horizon, heart heavy but fierce. The railway trestle rose before them, a skeleton of rusted iron and splintered wood. Shadows moved beneath its beams, and the air hummed with the memory of Jesse, his laughter, his regrets, his final warning, trust no one. They dismounted in silence, drawn together by necessity and fear. Somewhere out in the wild, enemies circled, their knives sharpened by greed and hate. But now, for the first time, Kate was not entirely alone. In the West, even a widow could make her own luck, if she could survive what was coming next. The morning air at the old trestle was sharp, filled with the scent of creosote and rust. Beneath its skeletal beams, Kate, Doc, and Billy moved with care, picking their way over broken ties and tangled weeds. The place seemed to hum with old memories and danger, as if the ground itself remembered every footstep, every secret. Jesse's name seemed to echo between the crumbling beams, reminders of who he had been and what he had left behind. Doc searched the perimeter while Kate and Billy scouted beneath the bridge. Billy, still jittery from his narrow escape, glanced up at every bird call and snapped twig, his young face shadowed with worry. But Kate's focus stayed sharp. She scanned the weathered timbers, her hands running over the wood, searching for the sign she hoped Jesse had left for her. She found it at last, a loose plank beneath the eastern side, nearly hidden by vines. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a strip of Jesse's old shirt, lay a bundle of faded letters, yellowed with age. She turned them over with trembling hands, her heart hammering as she recognized Jesse's handwriting. His voice came to her in those familiar jagged lines, each word a mixture of regret, hope, and unspoken love. The letters were confessions, raw admissions of mistakes, of crimes done for survival, of the burden he had carried since falling in with Tolliver and the gang. He wrote of choices made in desperation, of the times he'd tried to set things right, and of the guilt that gnawed at him long before the law ever closed in. In one letter, Jesse wrote of a final betrayal, a secret he could never speak aloud, hinting that the true enemy was not among his outlaw kin, but wore a badge in town. Kate read on, eyes stinging with emotion. Between the lines, a pattern emerged, one Jesse had feared to spell out directly. He spoke of a ledger, hidden somewhere safe, filled with records of bribes and deals that went all the way to the sheriff's office. The gold was not simply loot from robberies, it was payoff money, laundered through the hands of officials who now sought to erase every trace of their involvement. Jesse's hope had been to clear his own name, not for pride, but so Kate would not have to live under the weight of his sins. While Kate read, Doc kept watch, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. Billy fidgeted nearby, studying the faded map fragment Kate had discovered. There was little time for peace. Suddenly, a sharp whistle echoed through the ravine, a warning too late. Men appeared at both ends of the bridge, guns drawn, faces half hidden by the morning sun. Tolliver's gang had found them. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the ancient beams, sending Kate and Billy diving for cover behind the stone pilings. Doc, caught in the open, returned fire, his hand trembling but his aim true. For a breathless moment, the world shrank to noise and fear, a chaos of shouting men, flying lead, and the acrid smell of smoke. Kate clutched the letters to her chest, praying Jesse's secrets would not die with her. A bullet tore past, grazing Doc's arm, spinning him sideways. He fell hard, dropping his revolver, blood soaking through his sleeve. Billy crawled to his side, eyes wide with terror, but hands steady as he helped Doc press a rag against the wound. Kate fired once, forcing the nearest outlaw back, then dragged Doc and Billy behind a fallen timber, heart racing. The fight was fierce but brief. Outnumbered, Kate's small group made a desperate run for the creek, using the cover of smoke and confusion to escape into the thickets beyond. Doc sagged in the saddle as Billy helped him mount, the boy's strength surprising for his age. Kate led the way, clutching Jesse's letters, the weight of truth as heavy as any iron. When at last they reached safety, deep in the shelter of the willows, Kate turned to Doc, her breath ragged. She showed him the letters, letting him read the damning confessions and hints of corruption. The news hit Doc like a blow. He had always suspected the sheriff was rotten, but to see it spelled out, to know Jesse had been a pawn in a much larger game, twisted something inside him. Doc's wound was bad, but he refused to rest, pushing Kate to keep moving. They both knew Tolliver would not give up, not with so much at stake. As Billy helped Doc, Kate read the final letter again, noting Jesse's plea. If you find this, trust your own heart, Kate. The gold is less than you think. The truth is worth more. With Doc wounded and the threat closing in, Kate's resolve hardened. She would not just run or hide. She would find the ledger, prove Jesse's innocence, and bring down the men who had betrayed them both. Her love for Jesse was tangled now with pain and fury, but also with a fierce, unyielding purpose. As the sun climbed higher, casting the world in sharp relief, Kate realized the real fight was only beginning. The gold was bait. The truth was the real prize. If she wanted justice, she would have to become more than a widow haunted by scandal. She would have to become the hunter. The sun pressed down, relentless, as Kate, Billy, and Doc pushed farther into the canyons north of Dry Creek. The land grew harsher with every mile, deep gullies and red rocks twisting the trail into a maze. Doc's wound festered, sweat beading on his brow, but he insisted on moving. He wrapped a dirty cloth tight around his arm, jaw clenched against the pain, refusing to slow down. Every step forward, Kate felt the noose tightening. Tolliver's men were hunting them, their tracks winding close behind, and now the law was in the mix. The sound of hooves and distant shouts haunted the air. Billy, usually quick with questions, had gone silent, watching shadows as if expecting them to leap alive with danger at any moment. Doc's breathing grew ragged. Kate forced him to rest in a sliver of shade beneath a boulder, while Billy kept watch with Jesse's old rifle balanced awkwardly in his hands. She checked Doc's bandage, blood seeping through, flesh angry and swollen. They had no real medicine, just whiskey and hope. Still, Doc managed a wry smile, eyes sharpening as she showed him Jesse's map again, running her finger along the faded lines. Their escape had led them here, not by luck, but by Jesse's design. The map fragment hinted at another hiding place, an abandoned mining camp somewhere above the canyon floor. Kate trusted Jesse's instincts even in death, and now she felt that trust being tested by every twist in the trail. By midday, the heat shimmered, and the only sound was the wind sifting through sage and stone. A shriek of a hawk overhead set Billy's nerves jangling. Then, suddenly, shouts and gunshots echoed from above. Kate shoved Doc behind a tumble of rocks, motioned Billy down, and peered out. 3 riders in deputies' badges thundered down the switchback, pistols drawn, hollering for Kate to show herself. A desperate chase exploded through the canyon. Kate swung up behind Doc on Dolly, Billy clinging behind her. The horse thundering down dry riverbeds, dust and gunfire filling the air. Rocks splintered beside them as bullets found their mark in stone. Doc's grip weakened, nearly slipping off, but Kate clung to him, refusing to let him fall. Billy squeezed his eyes shut, arms tight around her waist. They dodged down a narrow defile, the deputies' shouts growing fainter. At last, the world fell silent except for the rasp of their breaths and the ticking of cooling metal. Kate risked a look back. No sign of pursuit for now. She slid off Dolly, knees weak, heart hammering. Doc slumped forward, his skin gray. The wound looked worse now. She forced more whiskey into him, feeling helpless and furious in equal measure. Billy trembled, near tears, but forced himself to stand watch while Kate scouted ahead. In the stillness, a chill prickled Kate's skin. Someone had been here before them. Old ashes and boot prints around the collapsed entrance of the mine. She crept closer, fingers tense on her revolver. Suddenly a hand clamped over her mouth. Kate twisted free, teeth bared, and nearly fired, until she saw the battered face of an old miner she recognized. Gus, a drifter who had once played cards with Jesse. He had been hiding too, but now he stared at Kate with wide, frightened eyes. Before she could ask, gunshots cracked behind them, Billy screaming her name as deputies burst from the brush, seizing him. Panic flared, white-hot. Kate rushed back. But the deputies held Billy tight, pistols at his head. One jeered at Kate, waving a blood-stained badge. "Give us the map, or the boy dies," he sneered. Kate froze. every muscle locked in indecision. She could run, take Jesse's clues, and vanish into the wild. But Billy's terrified face broke her resolve. She stepped forward, hands raised, voice steady as she bluffed. She had hidden the real map piece with Doc and only gave up the torn Bible page, buying time as the deputies argued over its worth. In the confusion, Gus hurled a rock, striking one deputy in the head. Kate lunged, tackling another, while Doc, summoning the last of his strength, fired a single wild shot that scattered the attackers. In the chaos, Billy broke free. They scrambled into the mine, stones tumbling in their wake. Inside, the air was cool and thick with dust. Kate's heart pounded as she realized they had survived. Barely, but at a cost. In the dim half-light, as Doc slumped against the wall, face twisted with pain and shame, he finally spoke words he had hidden too long. Voice shaking, he confessed to Kate. Long ago, he had helped the sheriff frame Jesse, altering evidence for a price, thinking it would all be forgotten in time. He had never meant for it to destroy so many lives. Kate stared at him, the betrayal cutting deep. She saw Doc's remorse, but trust was shattered. Still, she knew they needed him, now more than ever. The West was a place where even traitors could be redeemed, and where every sin left its mark. Outside, the sun slipped toward the horizon, bathing the canyon in blood-red light. Kate gathered herself, tending to Doc, comforting Billy, and staring at Jesse's map. They had more enemies than ever, but now, at last, she understood the true stakes. It was not gold, but justice and survival. And as the night fell, Kate steeled herself for whatever would come next. The night crept in, thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust, as Kate, Billy, and Doc huddled inside the crumbling shell of the abandoned mine. Doc lay half-conscious, sweat beading on his brow as Kate packed his wound with scraps of cloth torn from her dress. The boy sat nearby, hugging his knees to his chest, eyes wide and silent in the darkness. Outside, the canyon echoed with the distant clatter of horses' hooves and the hoots of Tolliver's men, growing bolder as the moon climbed higher. For hours, they waited, every sound a threat, every breath measured against the possibility of discovery. Hope flickered, but the night had sharpened into something hard and merciless. Kate forced herself to stay awake, mind racing through Jesse's letters, Doc's confession, and the fragments of clues they had gathered. Justice seemed as far away as the horizon. She wondered if they'd ever see daylight again. At dawn, the world erupted in violence. They never saw who betrayed them. Maybe it was the deputies, maybe an old miner bribed with a coin, or perhaps simply the luckless turn of fate that always seemed to haunt the Cole name. A hail of bullets split the morning quiet. Smoke and shouts filled the air as Tolliver's gang swarmed the entrance, guns drawn, faces twisted with greed and hatred. Kate fought with the desperation of the cornered, but there were too many. She was wrenched from cover, hands bound tight behind her back, her cheek pressed to the cold stone floor. Billy screamed, trying to fight, until a rough hand struck him silent. Doc slumped, helpless, barely conscious as he was dragged away by two men with cruel grins. Tolliver himself loomed over Kate, his scarred jaw set in a snarl, eyes burning with triumph. He demanded the final piece of Jesse's map, voice thick with threat and impatience. Kate spat blood, refusing to answer. Tolliver's men laughed, delighted at her defiance, and dragged Billy before her, knife pressed to the boy's throat as a warning. Kate's heart twisted, but still she held silent. She would not give them the satisfaction. In that moment, she saw just how far they would go, how little her life, or Billy's, meant to these men. The hours blurred into a haze of pain and fear. Bound in the stifling gloom of the mine's side chamber, Kate forced herself to recall every detail of Jesse's clues, every hint buried in his letters and Bible. There, in the darkness, a truth took shape. The map was not just a path to gold. Jesse's references to buried secrets and ledgers in the mission's walls suggested something bigger, a trail of evidence, not just treasure. The real map was a metaphor, a puzzle pointing to the mission outside town, where the corrupt sheriff and Tolliver had hidden their misdeeds for years. Suddenly, a distant commotion echoed through the tunnels. Shouts, gunfire, the boom of dynamite, Tolliver's men scrambling, arguing. Through a crack in the rock, Kate caught a glimpse of Doc, battered but alive, crawling through the dust with a wild, desperate look in his eyes. He dragged himself up and, with the last of his strength, fired blindly into the fray, a distraction that sent the guards scattering. Seizing the chance, Kate wriggled free of her bonds, the rope slick with her blood. She lunged for Billy, hauling him up just as a stray bullet shattered the lantern overhead. Darkness spilled into the chamber, shouts rising as the mine shook with chaos. Kate half-dragged, half-carried Billy through a maze of tunnels, guided by memory and luck. The mine entrance blazed with firelight, but she found a narrow vent shaft Jesse had once used as a boy, and shoved Billy through first, following into the choking dust. They emerged into dawn, battered and bleeding, just as Doc staggered out behind them, clutching his wounded arm. Tolliver's men were in disarray, confused by the explosion, arguing amongst themselves. Kate didn't stop to look back. She led Billy and Doc into the scrub, keeping low, hearts pounding in their chests. For the first time in days, hope flickered. They were alive, if only barely. But the truth was clear. They were hunted, wounded, and outnumbered, with Tolliver and the sheriff's men still on their trail. Doc collapsed in the shade of a juniper, gasping for breath. Kate tended his wounds as best she could, her hands steady even as her mind reeled. She pressed Jesse's final letter into her pocket, feeling its weight as a promise and a burden. They had survived capture, survived torture, and now, by the narrowest of margins, they had escaped. But the mission awaited, and inside its ancient walls, the last pieces of Jesse's puzzle waited to be revealed. As the sun rose, lighting the world in gold and crimson, Kate steeled herself for what was coming. The road ahead was perilous, and the West would demand everything she had left. But she would not falter. The fight was not over, not while Jesse's name hung in the balance, and not while those who had betrayed them still walked free. The sun hung low, casting jagged shadows across the parched landscape as Kate, Billy, and Doc pressed on through the brush. Their bodies ached with exhaustion, but the promise of truth pulled them forward. Toward the old Spanish mission that stood alone on the outskirts of Dry Creek, its whitewashed walls peeling beneath the relentless western sky. With every step, Kate felt the burden of Jesse's secrets and the weight of a town's judgment, but she pressed on, her resolve as fierce as the desert wind. The mission had once been a sanctuary, its stone archways and silent cloisters, a place of refuge for travelers and the faithful. Now it loomed as a relic of a forgotten era, haunted by the memories of prayers unanswered and deals made in the dark. Kate approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for movement among the broken columns and tumbled grave markers. The silence was thick and foreboding, a hush that spoke of danger waiting just beyond the next doorway. Inside, the cool air smelled of old earth and dust. Faded murals still clung to the walls, saints and martyrs staring down with hollow eyes. In the stillness, Kate led her wounded companions through the nave, the boards creaking beneath their boots. Billy kept close, eyes wide and alert, while Doc limped behind, sweat beading on his brow. They moved like ghosts through the mission's corridors, following the path Jesse had hinted at in his final letter. Hidden beneath the altar, just as Jesse had promised, they found a hollow stone. Billy pried it loose with trembling hands, revealing a small tin box. Inside, bundles of brittle letters and ledger books spilled out, evidence of deals struck between the sheriff, Tolliver, and a host of town officials. Pages were covered in bribes, signatures, and payouts, each detail carefully recorded in Jesse's cramped handwriting. There were names Kate recognized: merchants, deputies, the preacher, even the mayor. Each entry a nail in the coffin of the town's innocence. The proof was undeniable, and the stakes higher than Kate had imagined. She could feel the world shifting beneath her feet. Jesse had never truly been the villain. He had been set up, a scapegoat for men who wore badges and cloaks of respectability. The realization burned through her, anger and grief mixing into something sharper: purpose. But even as they absorbed the gravity of what they had found, the sound of boots on flagstones broke the silence. Tolliver and his men poured into the mission, guns drawn, their eyes wild with greed and desperation. Behind them strode Sheriff McCall himself, his badge glinting in the dying light. He moved with the confidence of a man used to power, his hand resting easy on his revolver as he surveyed the intruders. A tense standoff crackled in the air, every heartbeat a countdown to violence. Kate clutched the ledgers to her chest, meeting the sheriff's gaze with defiance. McCall demanded the papers, voice cold and dangerous, promising mercy if she complied. But Kate saw the lie in his eyes. There would be no mercy, not for her, not for Billy, not for anyone who could speak the truth. Suddenly, chaos erupted. A gunshot shattered the quiet, followed by a storm of bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. Doc, using the last of his strength, tackled a deputy, sending both crashing into a pile of crumbling pews. Billy scrambled for cover, dodging between fallen pillars. Kate ducked behind the altar, firing blindly, the ledgers pressed tight against her heart. Tolliver's men turned on one another, greed overriding loyalty as the promise of gold and power frayed their uneasy alliance. In the confusion, one of Tolliver's lieutenants drew a knife, slashing at another, their shouts echoing off ancient stone. The sheriff, realizing his grip on control was slipping, fired wildly, desperate to silence Kate before she could escape with the evidence. Amid the violence, Kate moved with desperate determination. She darted through the crossfire, Billy at her side, dodging splinters and bullets. She saw Doc fall, blood blossoming on his shirt, but still, he shouted for her to run. Heart aching, Kate dragged Billy toward a side door, clutching the ledgers as her only shield. Outside, the mission's courtyard was a battleground. Two of Tolliver's men lay sprawled in the dust, while the rest scattered, their courage evaporating as the sheriff's lies unraveled. Tolliver himself staggered after Kate, gun raised, fury twisting his features. But as he fired, the gun jammed. Billy seized the moment, hurling a rock with all his strength, striking Tolliver in the temple. The outlaw crumpled, defeated by the very child he had once threatened. Kate, battered but unbroken, helped Billy over the low wall and into the brush beyond. Behind them, the mission burned, a final reckoning for the sins of the powerful. As smoke rose against the evening sky, Kate pressed the ledgers to her chest. The real treasure was not gold, but the truth. Proof strong enough to bring down the men who had destroyed Jessie, and nearly destroyed her. She led Billy and the wounded Doc into the darkness, leaving the ruins behind. The fight for justice was not over, but for the first time, hope glimmered on the horizon. The West was vast and unforgiving, but Kate was no longer running. She was ready to stand and face the world, armed with the truth and a courage born of loss. The night after the battle at the mission was long and uneasy, filled with the crackle of distant flames and the restless stir of guilt and hope. Kate kept to the shadows, tending Doc's wounds beneath the shelter of twisted mesquite while Billy kept watch. In the darkness, the ledgers, tucked safely beneath her coat, felt heavier than gold, as if every secret and every sin within their pages pressed down on her soul. She could not sleep, her mind alive with the ghosts of Jessie's words and the faces of all who had suffered under the thumb of the town's powerful men. At first light, Kate made her decision. There would be no more running. The time had come to face the heart of Dry Creek and lay the truth bare, whatever the cost. She saddled Dolly, helped Doc climb up behind her, and lifted Billy onto a borrowed mule they'd found grazing at the edge of the mission's ruins. With each mile toward town, tension gathered in the pit of her stomach. Every fence post and boulder seemed to whisper warning, but she pressed on. Dry Creek was different when they returned. Quiet, wary, the air full of smoke and unease. The townsfolk, still shaken by the firefight at the mission and the rumors swirling in its wake, watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. A few braver souls gathered at the edge of Main Street as Kate and her battered companions rode slowly through town, the ledgers visible in her arms like a banner. She steered Dolly straight to the saloon, where the sheriff held court most mornings, surrounded by deputies and men loyal to him out of fear or greed. She knew what she risked: an ambush, a bullet, the jeers of a town still half convinced of her guilt. But Kate's stride was steady as she stepped through the swinging doors, the ledgers in her grasp, her eyes burning with determination. Inside, the saloon fell to silence. The sheriff looked up, his face hard and unreadable. Tolliver nowhere in sight. For a moment, the whole world seemed to balance on a knife's edge. Kate placed the ledgers on the bar with a deliberate calm, the thud of their weight echoing through the room. She called for the townsfolk to gather, her voice steady and clear. Word spread quickly, and soon men and women, young and old, spilled into the saloon and crowded at the windows. Eyes that had once looked at her with scorn now held uncertainty, fear, and the first glimmers of curiosity. She saw familiar faces: Mrs. Hammond from the store, old Mr. Harmon, Pearl, and the preacher, each drawn by the promise of something too big to ignore. With trembling hands, Kate opened the ledgers, reading aloud the evidence of years of corruption: bribes to deputies, secret land deeds, hush money exchanged in the name of justice. The names on the pages matched those in the crowd. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the room as more details came to light. Kate's voice never wavered as she spoke of Jesse, his innocence, and the sacrifice he had made so that these truths might finally see daylight. The sheriff's grip on power frayed with every page. Someone in the crowd shouted for him to answer, while others began to whisper and point, their outrage growing louder. At last, the sheriff drew his gun, desperation twisting his features. He demanded the ledgers and threatened anyone who dared stand against him. But this time, the room stood firm, Kate saw it in their eyes, a shared resolve that had been missing for too long. Tolliver burst in, wild-eyed and desperate, his shirt torn and blood on his cheek. He made a last, reckless attempt to seize Kate and the papers, but the crowd closed ranks around her. Someone tackled Tolliver from behind, and a brief, furious struggle broke out. In the chaos, Billy, small and swift, grabbed the sheriff's dropped gun and slid it across the floor to Kate. She picked it up, but she did not shoot. Instead, she called for calm, her voice ringing out above the confusion. She pressed the ledgers into the hands of the preacher, insisting he keep them safe until the judge from the next county arrived. As deputies hesitated and townsfolk closed in on the sheriff, the illusion of his power finally crumbled. With nowhere left to run and no allies left to shield him, the sheriff was forced to surrender. The deputies removed his badge and bound his hands, their eyes lowered in shame. Tolliver, bruised and beaten, was hauled away to await justice. The saloon swelled with the sound of angry voices, but also with something new, a sense of relief and a hope that the old order might truly be over. Kate, her heart pounding and her eyes wet with tears, turned to the crowd. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did she dwell on revenge. Instead, she spoke of Jesse, of sacrifice, and of what justice really meant. The words came not from bitterness, but from the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had lost nearly everything and survived. As the sheriff was led away in chains and the sun rose over Dry Creek, the town began to awaken to a new day, one shaped by the truth Kate had fought so fiercely to reveal. The burden she had carried for so long grew lighter, replaced by a fragile, stubborn hope that justice, however late, might finally have a place in the unforgiving West. Morning settled over Dry Creek with a hush that felt unfamiliar, like the first breath after a storm. Word of the sheriff's fall and the arrests of Tolliver and his men spread quickly. For the first time in years, the air in town felt clean, unburdened by secrets. The townsfolk emerged in cautious clusters, glancing at Kate not with fear or contempt, but with a complicated mix of curiosity, shame, and fragile respect. She felt their eyes on her as she walked down Main Street, Jesse's letters and the ledgers finally in safe hands. The preacher, eyes heavy with remorse, came to her first. He offered a quiet apology on behalf of the town, his words weighed down with guilt and gratitude. Others followed, Mrs. Hammond pressing a warm loaf of bread into Kate's arms, Old Man Harmon tipping his hat, Pearl whispering a timid, "Thank you." Their gestures were awkward, hesitant, but Kate understood. Trust would not come easy, not after so much pain and suspicion, but the first stones had been laid for something new. Billy, never far from Kate's side, watched it all with wide-eyed wonder. He clung to her coat, uncertain of his place in this changed world, but she reached for his hand, squeezing it in silent reassurance. Doc, arm in a sling and face drawn with exhaustion, stood on the porch of the doctor's house, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He would recover, though scars, seen and unseen, would linger. For the first time in a long while, Doc looked less like a man running from himself and more like someone considering the road ahead. Later that day, the judge arrived from the neighboring county. The evidence Kate brought was damning, with the sheriff and his deputies stripped of their badges, and Tolliver and his surviving men bound for prison. The last holdouts of the old corrupt order fell apart. There were hard questions, and some old wounds would never heal. But the ledgers, signed statements, and Jesse's letters told a story that no one could ignore. Jesse Cole's name, once a curse, was cleared at last, his guilt replaced by the public knowledge that he had tried to stand against evil, even at the cost of his own life. Kate stood on the steps of the town hall as the verdict was read, her heart heavy but finally at peace. She felt Jesse's presence in the morning wind, in the sigh of the old willow tree by the churchyard, in the hopeful glances of the children who played once again on the streets he'd once walked in fear. For the first time, the story of Kate Cole was not just one of loss and betrayal, but of courage, truth, and quiet redemption. When the crowd dispersed, Billy stayed at her side. He had no family to return to, and Kate, though still grieving, knew that life rarely gave second chances so clearly. She offered Billy a home, not out of pity, but out of a shared understanding of survival and loyalty. He accepted with a shy nod, and in his smile Kate saw the beginnings of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Doc, now a hero in his own way, made his farewells. The town would always remember his past mistakes, but Kate pressed Jesse's old lucky coin into his hand, a simple symbol of forgiveness and the chance to start anew. Doc rode out at dawn, heading west for a place where his debts could not follow, leaving behind a letter of thanks and a promise to live a better life. As the days turned, Kate and Billy worked the land around their cabin, planting a small garden, mending fences, tending to Dolly and the chickens that had miraculously survived the fire. The place was changed, scarred by violence but still standing, a testament to their resilience. The townsfolk, slowly, began to return her waves, to trade goods, to ask for advice and offer help when they could. There were still whispers. There always would be. But the worst of the hate had faded, replaced by something like hope. Kate visited Jesse's grave at sunset, her hand resting on the cold stone, the last of his letters folded in her pocket. She spoke quietly to him, telling him of their victory, their losses, and the uncertain, open future. She promised to carry on his fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all who had no voice. She left a sprig of sage and the lucky coin on his headstone, a final token of love, forgiveness, and goodbye. On the morning of their departure, Kate and Billy packed their few belongings into saddlebags. Kate glanced back at Dry Creek, the place that had nearly broken her, and found that the bitterness in her heart had softened. She saw the town not just as a place of pain, but as a hard-won home, a place where she had become more than a widow marked by scandal. She was now a survivor, a protector, and at last, her own woman. As they rode westward into the rising sun, Billy at her side and the vast open land unfurling before them, Kate felt the weight of the past finally lift. There would always be scars, but there would also be new beginnings. She held her head high, Jesse's memory alive not as a shadow, but as a source of strength. Ahead lay a future shaped by their courage, where hope and freedom waited just beyond the next horizon. And so Kate Cole, once the widow scorned, now the woman who had faced down a town and won, rode out to claim her place beneath the wide, wild sky of the West, her story just beginning.